He's got the money to be able to develop it himself, with no experience whatsoever, and he's just a loose cannon. And in the end, we just drive by that building every single, weekend, and you're just going like, man, who let that guy build that building? There needs to be some restraint. There's a lot of crazy people out there, guys. Come on. There was also something the province was talking about too, about like maybe reviewing employment lands and different things in the province, and they were talking about that recently, and some people are concerned about, if the province starts to, I don't know, get excited and starts to allow for more residential development, that's going to hurt us. What's that all about?
Yeah, they were looking at that. I think just everything that's happened over the past couple of months, they'll probably back away from that. I wouldn't be surprised if that happens. That's it, and it just goes back to like, guys, just release the PMTSAs, release the major transit station area policies, do the work you want to do in terms of housing creation there. Like if you legitimately want to create an environment where people can build a ton of houses and not have to go through an arduous process, then add the as of right permissions the way BC just did to Ontario transit stations. The template's there. You've done it. The city's done it. Like
BC does things first and then we follow usually. So that would be something that I would look forward to.
We didn't have to in this case. We could have been first to it, and we weren't. So like the city got their part of the equation done back in 2022, and the province has been sitting on it since. So like I don't see a reason for them to open up employment areas or even expand urban boundaries.
Well, but what about all these employment areas that are like right beside new subway stations? It's like, what the fuck? Like, is it Jane and Finch or Finch and Keele? Somewhere in Finch, it's all employment around it, and you got a brand new subway station there, and nobody can live near it, and there's not too many people that like can work in that area. So like what?
That needs to change, though. Obviously, whoever owns the buildings. I mean, vacancy is super low right now. Like, I imagine they're being used, but over time, they'll be used better.
But they can't be used more than their capacity, right? Like, they're just employment. Like,
people need to get to work, so you got to take a subway to somewhere. So
you get to take a bus to work. You get to live. Yeah, you gotta have. If you're gonna put all this money
downtown, right? They got to go to their blue collar job.
Yeah, you got to go to a different employment area further away on a GO train now, because people got to live closer.
From home.
Work from home.
Yeah, that's it.
What about?
You're making all the right points. Like the thing is, if those lands go away, if all of a sudden you introduce residential onto those employment lands, then they're never going to be employment again. You're never like, who knows what happens in 20 or 30 years. Like once you get rid of those employment lands, they're toast. And once you introduce employment or residential uses into employment lands, then it has an impact on the surrounding uses, because if anybody has like a noxious use or there's noise or odor or dust, generally the obligation to mitigate towards the sensitive use, which is the residential use, is on the emitter. So if you put a condo up next to a slaughterhouse, all of a sudden you've cost the slaughterhouse a whole pile of money. And like a good example of that is down on Wellington Street in Toronto, just around Niagara, the Niagara neighborhood. There's a works yard there, and it was by the railway, and nobody lived there except for the subdivision, the older houses on Niagara there. But there was a works yard, and it operated, and it was fine. And then west of Stanley Park, there was a couple of condos that got built, 12-story, 15-story condos in the 2000s. And because of the noise from the works yard, the city had to put up these huge acoustic barriers. So the city had to spend a bunch of money mitigating noise from that use from the source, because the new residential buildings were up. And the similar thing happened with the slaughterhouse that was right next to it as well, which ultimately closed. That was a crazy building. Speaking of really interesting projects, the thing TAS is doing down there, that's going to be great when it's done. But that's one of the issues with employment land. So once you start the intrusion of residential uses, then it sort of has ripple effects to everything else, and people aren't able to use those adjacent employment areas for certain types of uses. So you're sort of diminishing the ability of them to serve the city's economic function.
If you give us the as of right increase across the board, and you give us something like to follow, then we don't need those employment lands. Like, we can figure stuff out within the boundaries that you give us. But like I've been saying since day one, like, just give me a playbook that everybody's going to play by. Okay. It sets the land value for the seller. It sets the land value for the buyer. Everybody knows the deal. It's like, this is what this is. Done. Let's all move on. But instead, it's like this crazy guessing game and like all this misinformation about the values and what can be here. And everybody's like, I think I could do this. And okay, well, can I convince everybody else that like, does everybody agree with me? No, they don't. Okay, well, now, fuck, they didn't agree with that. Now I got to do this. Does this work? No, this doesn't work. Okay, the deal's dead now, right?
Yeah.
Or like,
Well,
it's a ridiculous process. And how much money do people spend to just figure out if something is maybe viable? You know, because we don't, how do you even know what rules to follow? You got like the rules that are written, you got all these things that they've put out there that aren't really in law that they kind of enforce some of the time, depending on who you're dealing with, right? It's like, of course we're never going to get anything, but like who can't figure out really easily that it's like, here's the rules, go play by the rules. And no, we're not going to like let you play outside of the rules, but if you're willing to stay inside the rules, it's going to be like really fast.
well, I think that's where they're headed, but there's always people who want to push a little further. Like because if you say, oh yeah, 6 stories on major streets, go do that. You've created a lot of value and a lot of housing opportunity across the city, but you've also created a circumstance where people are going to say, well, I want to do 8. I think there's a reason for me to do 8 here. And maybe that's totally justified, right? And so that's why you've got the planning process. But if you can, I agree with you to the point where if you can open up more opportunity, if there's a greater spectrum of stuff you can do through a really quick process, then that's ultimately a benefit.
But what if everybody agreed?
I'm on the other side though when it comes to
you can only do 8.
too much freedom, because there's been eras where they were allowing that, and you get a bunch of ugly buildings from people who shouldn't be doing it, and you get a bunch of things that don't make sense. And there's plenty of cities that have examples, and Greg, I'm sure in school they teach you all that. That's the whole point of being a planner, is to make sure that at the end of the day, for the next 100 years, everyone's going to look and go, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah,
and so there are like places that just don't fall into that.
If
right?
you took pictures of society now, you'd think architecture included tents. This is part of the problem. So like, do we want this period to be defined by boring buildings with
tents
people in them?
Our grandkids will never know they existed.
Oh, TK.
I'm just saying that there has to be some limitations. This is the other side of the argument that you don't want to hear, but it's the reality is that you can't just give everybody the ability to be able to do within a certain framework on any certain property, because there's going to be certain situations where, like the Davenport one, maybe in that case, that property would have been too, like it would have stood out too much because of the hill. Like you have to really look at each property individually in order to
the beauty of
make the decision. Yeah.
It's as somebody who wrote I put together the laneway suite bylaw, right? With the team we were working with on that. And we tried to make it work as best as possible on all the lots where it could, be applied. But you can't, you're never going to do it where it works 100% of the time. You just can't. And that's where you have that process where the marginal, examples have to be looked at a little bit closer, and maybe they present other opportunities. I think it's always going to be the case. But if you make it easier and you provide people with more opportunities within the spectrum of what is as of right, and the carrot is the process is going to be really quick, you can just go in and get a building permit, then people are going to do it. And we've seen that, and we'll continue to. And I think, the point of whether the buildings look nice or not, I think is sort of subjective. Like people talk about the Daniel Libeskind crystal at the ROM all the time. And I love that building. It looks ridiculous. I like it. Some people think it's absurd. So, I like that kind of stuff. I think the city needs just as much of that, because I think if you have an equal amount of people that actually can't stand a building and otherwise really love it, then you actually have a really interesting building. There's a ton of buildings in the city that are just like, man, the spectrum of people's opinions is quite narrow.
If there's if there's a subjective artistic point, but I'm talking about some guy who owns a lot on the corner of Islington and the Westway, and he's just like, hey, you know what? I'm doing a 6-story building. He's got the money to be able to develop it himself, with no experience whatsoever, and he's just a loose cannon. And in the end, we just drive by that building every single weekend, and you're just going like, man, who let that guy build that building? There needs to be some restraint. There's a lot of crazy people out there, guys. Come on.
Hey guys, thanks for watching our clips channel. Why don't you go and check out some more clips? We got lots of other good content somewhere over here. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.
Boom.
That was good.
That was good. I like that. That was good.